Hello, everyone. My name is Lou Marcos, and I'm a professor of English and scholar in residence at Houston Baptist University, where I've taught since 1991. I had hoped to give this talk on the campus of Houston Baptist University for one of our Thursday chapel services. Unfortunately, we've had another partial shutdown due to the quarantine, and so I will be tape recording this instead, but it will hopefully allow more people to listen. Now, the subject of my talk today is the psychology of sin. C.S. Lewis wrestles with hell. Now, I do agree that hell may not be the topic you want to talk about during a pandemic with death leering in the face, but it is an important topic. C.S. Lewis himself said, of all the doctrines of Christianity, I would most like to get rid of the doctrine of hell, but I can't. First of all, one of the biggest reasons we can't simply do away with the doctrine of hell is that no figure in the Bible talks more about hell and devils than Jesus himself. The most we know about hell are in the words in red, as we say. But also we need the doctrine of hell because if the Bible is true that God has given us free will, I don't mean absolute free will, but God has made us moral, ethical creatures where our choices have consequences. And if there is no hell, if there's no ability to choose the wrong choice, then that will is not really real. But first, we need to understand what heaven and hell are. Now, the Bible tells us things about heaven and hell, not as much as we would like, but it does tell us certain things. But I will tell you this. Whatever else hell is, whether or not there's literal hellfire, whether there's a worm gnawing at us, whether or not those images are literal or figurative, the one thing clear in the Bible is that what hell means is to be cast out of the presence of God for eternity. Heaven, whatever else it is, whether or not the harps are literal, whether we're wearing cloaks or gowns or whatever else we know about heaven, it means this: being in the presence of God for eternity. Look, if you don't want to be in the presence of God for all eternity, then you don't want to be in heaven. You actually want to be in hell. As C.S. Lewis himself says in many of his works, hell is ultimately something we choose. Or if we truly desire heaven, we will not miss it. But what does it mean to desire heaven? It means to desire to be in the direct presence of the triune God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit for all eternity, to worship and participate in the triune life of God. Not everybody wants that. Many people do not want to be in the presence of God. Well, if you don't want to be in the presence of God, where else are you going to go? God is omnipresent or omnipresent. He is everywhere. And yet, out of love, God carved out one place in the universe where he is not. And that place is hell. Now, I am speaking an exaggeration here, because obviously God must be in hell a little bit, or hell would cease to exist. Nothing exists without God's presence and energy and life. But God's direct presence, his intimate presence, has surely been removed from hell. And so, if you don't want to be in God's presence, that's the only place in the universe to go. Now, that may sound crazy to you. How can a person possibly choose hell? Well, to help us understand this, let me borrow some other metaphors that I've learned from C.S. Lewis. Think for a moment. We call this a thought experiment. For a moment, instead of thinking about heaven and hell as destinations, let's think about heaven and hell as a process. Heaven and hell are states of being that we become. We are all on a continuum. With every choice we make, we are either moving closer to God or farther away from him. With every choice we make, we are either embracing God's grace and love and mercy and surrendering to that in obedient love, or with every choice we are moving away, rejecting that grace, preferring ourself and our sin over God's loving, intimate presence. So you see, if you're in heaven, that means that through God's grace, you have become a creature meant for heaven, a creature who will enjoy being in heaven in the direct presence of God. To be in hell is to be a creature who actually desires hell, who wants to be there, who fits in there because they don't want to be in the presence of God. A lot of times we think of hell as a giant swamp or maybe as a giant pit, I should say, that we're cast into for one big sin. I like to think of hell more as a swamp or a marsh that we sink into one little sin at a time. You see, the problem with sin is it's not only disobedience to God, it not only cuts us off from God in that way. Sin cuts us off from God because it de-humanizes us. With each sinful choice we make, with each rejection of God's love and grace, with each choosing of ourself and our sin, holding on to our resentments and our pride and our lust and all those things that hold us away from the embrace of God, each time we do that, we're surrendering a little bit of our humanity until there's nothing left. Do you know there's a verse in the Bible that suggests, if not specifically says, that hell was never intended to house human beings? And guess what? It's one of those words in red. You'll find it in the parable of the sheep and goats in Matthew chapter 25. To the sheep on his right, God says, "Come, ye blessed of my Father, and enter into the kingdom that was prepared for you from the beginning of time." But what does he say to the goats on his left? He says, "Depart from me, O ye wicked, into the lake of fire, which was prepared for the angel," or the devil, "and his fallen angels." Now, the lake of fire is hell. And Jesus is saying there that hell was somehow created to house fallen angels, what we call demons, not originally intended to house human beings, which suggests if we're still a human being when we die, we still have a chance of heaven. But again, the problem with sin is that it dehumanizes. The problem with sin, the problem with sin is not that it is beyond God's grace. God's grace is more powerful than anything. The people in hell are not beyond God's grace. The people in hell have lost their humanity. There is nothing left to save. One of my favorite of C.S. Lewis books is called the Screwtape Letters. And in that, a senior devil named Screwtape is writing a series of letters to a junior devil, his nephew, in fact, named Wormwood, teaching him how to tempt human beings and win them over for our Father below, as he calls the devil. And Wormwood, being a young demon, is all excited to get his patient, as we're called, into a big sin like murder or adultery and all that great stuff. And Screwtape says basically, "Wormwood, you're so young. Yes, I know those big sins are wonderful. It's great to see them squirm. But remember, Wormwood, it's often the big sinners that become the big saints. Remember that jaded party boy, St. Augustine. He's still causing us trouble." No. Look, the problem is not the size of the sin, explains Screwtape. It's not the size that matters. All that matters is the cumulative effect of those sins, that they slowly edge the man out of the light into the nothing. Wormwood, murder is no better than cards if cards will do the trick. It's better to give them a series of little sins so they won't even realize what's happening. No, Wormwood, he concludes, the safest road to hell is the gradual one, the gentle slope, soft underfoot, without sudden turnings, without milestones, without signposts. Little sin by little sin, we slowly give away our humanity until there's nothing left to save. Now, to understand this, because what I'm saying to you may make sense theologically, but you may be wondering, as I do, how is this possible psychologically? How can someone choose a method of life that will eventually rob them of their humanity and end them up outside of the presence of God? How is that possible psychologically? And to answer that, I want to turn to my single favorite C.S. Lewis book, the focus really of this talk, and that is a book called The Great Divorce. In this wonderful fantasy, Lewis wonders, it's what he calls a supposal. What if the sinners of hell, if they so choose, can get on a bus, and what if that bus will take them on a trip to heaven? And when they get off at heaven, the plane in front of heaven, what if the souls of the saints whom they knew in life come to meet them and try to convince them, even now, to give up their sin, their rebellion, their resentment, to give it up and embrace the love and mercy and grace of Christ? What would happen? Well, Lewis shows us that in every single case, with only one exception, the sinners, having seen hell and seen heaven, yet choose willingly to go back to hell. How is that possible? Well, to help us understand this, during this, it's about 100 pages. I'd encourage you to read this. I read it every year myself. We used to read it in FYS. It's well worth reading. What much of The Great Divorce falls into is a series of what psychologists would call case studies. So we get a series, about a dozen or so, dialogues between a damned soul and a blessed soul. And as we listen to that dialogue, each one of them is a case study because it sort of gives us an example of one type of sin, one type of, you can even call it a neurosis, if you will, a spiritual neurosis that keeps us away from God and robs us of our humanity. And I'm going to look at just 3 of these case studies. The first one comes right in the center of the book, and it's very short. But if we can understand this, we will understand what Lewis is saying and what I mean by the psychology of sin. All right. Lewis overhears a conversation between a blessed saint and the damned soul of a garrulous, complaining old woman. Now, I say dialogue, but it's not really a dialogue, because that woman goes on and on, mumbling and mumbling, grumbling and grumbling, complaining and complaining, so the poor saint can't get a word in edgewise. Finally, after this goes on for a page and a half, Lewis turns to his guide, George MacDonald, and says, "Sir, I don't understand what I'm seeing. I mean, this woman doesn't seem so bad. Does she really deserve to be in that terrible place of hell? I mean, she's only a grumbler. Is that so bad?" And George MacDonald says, "That's the question, my son. Is she a grumbler, or is she only a grumble? If there is one spark of humanity left in that woman, the angels can blow on it till it becomes a raging fire. But if all that's left is ashes, we'll not go on blowing ashes in our faces for eternity." The problem with that woman is not that she is beyond salvation. God's grace is a powerful thing. The problem with the woman is that there is nothing left to save. You know how this happens. I'm sure every one of you listening has at least somebody in your family. It could be you, that's been holding a grudge against someone else in the family for many, many years. Now, this is what happens when you start to feel a grudge or resentment or bitterness or anything like that. What happens, as soon as I decide to hold a grudge against someone else, I actually split into two different people. There's me, I'm mad at you, I resent you. But then there's the real me, the me that God created. And that me is standing outside and looking at the grudge me, and he's saying, let it go. Let it go. Now, in the beginning, I can, with God's grace, let it go and become human again. But you know what happens if you hold on to that grudge? If you nurse it and feed on it and feed on it, sooner or later, that other person, the real you, will disappear. And all that's left will be the grudge going on forever, like a broken record. I'll let you look that up in a dictionary if you don't know what a record is. On and on with no ending. It happens so slowly we don't notice it. Hair grows slowly, especially mine. But after 3 or 4 months, if I don't get a haircut because I'm in quarantine, I'll start looking like a wild man. Fingernails grow slowly. But if you didn't cut your fingernails for a year or two, you could join a circus. Right? It happens so slowly we don't notice it. Folks, if you grew up in a very, very strict home, you might have had this idea that when God looks down from heaven on us, he is absolutely disgusted. He holds his nose at horrible people. I don't think so. I think when God looks down from heaven, the first thing he sees is not our sin, not our depravity. I think the first thing he sees is that spark of life that he breathed into us in the beginning. And then he sees all that sin and depravity and rebellion and disobedience and ingratitude trying to crush and snuff that flame. And God so desires to blow on that flame until it will become a raging fire again. But remember what George MacDonald said. If there's nothing left but ashes, we'll not go on blowing ashes in our faces forever. That's what hell is. There's no spark left. It's been snuffed out. But friends, God desires to blow on that spark, to free us from the grudge that would swallow and absorb ourselves into it. God would restore our humanity. That's the first case study. The second case study is of a man who on earth was a landscape painter. And he is in hell, but he's taken the bus to heaven. And when he gets to heaven, he meets with the saved soul of a blessed saint who was a friend of his and was also a landscape painter. And when the damned soul gets to heaven, like I said, it's really a sort of grassy plain outside of heaven. When he gets there and looks around, he says, wow, this is beautiful. I wish I had brought my easel and my paint and my canvases so I could paint this. And the blessed soul says, we call him John, John, no. Listen to me. That's not the way it works here. You come here to enjoy, to know God. We can all see this country. Maybe after you've gotten strong enough, you can have your paints back, and then you can maybe help us see little details we might have missed. But we all see this country. Put down your easel and just enjoy and receive God's goodness and truth and beauty. And the damn soul says, what are you talking about? I'm a landscape painter. That's what I do. And the blessed soul says, John, think back with me. Think back to the beginning. Why did you become a landscape painter? It wasn't the landscape you were in love with. You were in love with the light behind the landscape, the light that was streaming through, and you hoped that if you used your very real artistic gift to paint that landscape just right, you might be able to incarnate that light and help others to see it. But John, what happened as you aged? You forgot about the light. Painting became an end in itself. It was only about the kind of canvas and the kind of paints and the medium and the genre and the ism, and you forgot your first love. John, look around you. This is the country where the light comes from. You have arrived. And anyway, they've forgotten all about us down on earth. They've moved on to another ism, another genre, another medium. And when John hears that, he says, "What? That's terrible. No. I have to go back down to hell. I have to make more paintings. I have to mount an exhibition." And in a second, he's gone. He has made it to the land where the light originated. But because he had lost his first love, because he had made painting an end in itself rather than a means to a higher end, he has ultimately sacrificed his humanity, his ability for joy, and really, ultimately, his true ability to create. Number 3, and this is the hardest case study in the whole book. On the bus from hell is the damned soul of a woman, a mother, who had several children. But when her child Michael died at a young age, she stopped living. She kind of ignored her husband and her other children, and she lived for the memory of her dead son, Michael. Almost Egyptian, as if she were mummifying it. And that became her whole life, the ritual of that. Now, when she gets to heaven, she doesn't meet Michael as she hoped. She meets her brother. But when she sees her brother, she doesn't go up to him and embrace him and kiss him. She says, "Where's Michael? I came here to see Michael, and I want to see him now." And the brother says, No, my dear. That's not the way it works here. You come here to see and love God. Once you love God fully, you'll be strong enough to have Michael back. But you can't. You're too weak to have Michael back now. "What?" she says. "God is love. And any God who would keep me away from my boy is a God I want nothing to do with." The woman said, "God is love." But what she really meant is love is God. Now, I'm an English professor, and those two things should mean the same thing. A equals B or B equals A, but they don't. Because God is love, which is a verse that you can find in 1 John. God is love means that part of the quality, the personhood, if you will, of the triune God is that he's a God of love. In fact, God is love in action. For the Father has always loved the Son, and the Son has always loved the Father. And the Holy Spirit, in some ways, is the love between Father and Son. But it's also God. It's a person of the Trinity. So God is love in action. But that's not what she meant. She meant love is God. And when we say love is God, what we're doing is we're taking a part of God and turning it into all of God. And when we do that, we commit idolatry, and we end up being cut off from God, and again, slowly lose our humanity. Idolatry means when you take anything that is not God and make it into God, it is an idol. And as C.S. Lewis said in a book he wrote called The Four Loves, any earthly love, not the full agape caritas love, but any earthly love, whether it's friendship or eros or affection that you feel for a child, when you take any of those loves, Lewis says, and turn it into a god, it will become a demon that will shatter your heart and shatter your very humanity. By the end of the dialogue, that woman is ready to take Michael with her back down into hell so she can care for him better than God. This is a difficult one, folks. How can we not have anything but pity and sorrow for that poor woman? But not only has she done something that has brought no comfort to her actual son Michael, who died, but she's destroyed everyone else in her family by the grief that she has made into an idol, that she has made into God. One thing I learned from this case study, and I've actually learned it from reading all of the works of Lewis, it's one of his greatest insights. It is more often the good things that keep us away from God than the bad things. Now that sounds pretty darn counterintuitive, but I do believe it's true. The good things. What are the good things? Mother love, patriotism, charitable work, humanitarianism, the arts and aesthetics. I'm an English professor. All of religion, just generically itself. These are all good things. But they're so good that they make good substitutes. As Lewis says, brass is more often mistaken for gold than clay is. Again, they're good things, but they're so close to God that they make good substitutes. And if we put them in place of God, they will become idols. What about the bad things? Serial promiscuity, drug addiction, alcohol, all of these things. Yeah, they're bad things, but you know what? Very few people can convince themselves that that is what they were made for. Nobody stuck in a terrible drug addiction is looking up and saying, yep, that's what I was made for. This is my life. This is it. No. You might do that with something good like mother love or philanthropy, but you're not going to do that, right? Now, you may think I'm going crazy here, but all I'm saying is what Jesus says. It is those who are sick who need the doctor, not those who are well. Of course, those who are well need the doctor too. They just don't admit that they need it. This is why when Jesus came, the good people, the Pharisees and Sadducees, most of them rejected him, while the prostitutes and tax collectors gathered around him. Why? Because they understood their need. These are difficult teachings, but I hope they will help you, as they've helped me, to explore yourself, to see what you are doing. Are you taking an earthly thing and making it into, you can even do that with a marriage. As good and God ordained as that was, we need to be careful that we don't make an earthly thing into an idol. Now, I've given you 3 case studies. We have the grumbler who has become a grumble. We have the landscape painter who has forsaken his first love and made painting into an end in itself. And we have that poor woman who has taken her grief and turned it into her God, so that she really doesn't even care for Michael anymore. Only the idol that she has made of her mother love. Dare I call it her smother love for her son. Now, is there anything that those 3 case studies have in common? I think they do. In one way or another, all 3 of those sinners, and in fact all the sinners we meet in the Great Divorce, are utterly narcissistic. Now, there's a good kind of self-love that we all need, but narcissism is a negative self-love that turns inward, away from the outer world, and turns into itself and stagnates that way. George MacDonald explains to C.S. Lewis in The Great Divorce that in the end, it all comes down to one decision. Either we say to God what Jesus said at the Garden of Gethsemane, thy will be done. Or God says to us, thy will be done. That's it, finally. Either we yield to God and trust him and embrace his intimate love and grace and mercy, or we choose ourselves and our sin. But be careful, Lewis warns. Heaven and hell work backwards. Once we get to heaven, we will look back and it will be as if we were always in heaven. Even the sorrows and the losses in our life, we will look back and they will take on the smell, the fragrance of heaven. But those in hell, when they look back, it will always be as if they were in hell. Now, Lewis says that's not what they'll say. They'll say, at least I was true to myself, right? Or they'll say, I did it and lived in accordance with my code. They'll say all these things. But what they really did is worship an idol rather than God. I think a lot of people, and I'm speaking here to mostly a college audience, I think a lot of us have this false idea that life is like college, and if we get an A, we go to heaven. If we get an F, we go to hell. But no, that's wrong. First of all, it's almost impossible to fail out of an American university. But seriously, folks, okay, that's not the way it works. It's not that there's one college that we get an A or an F in. There are two colleges. There is the College of Heaven and the College of Hell. Some say it's the same in Texas. You can go to UT or A&M. I'll let you decide which is which. But there's two different colleges. And if we go to the College of Heaven, Houston Baptist, we are majoring in God. And if we major in God and yearn for Him, what does Jesus promise? All those who ask will receive. All those who seek will find. To all those who knock, the door will be answered. If we are truly seeking to major in God, we will graduate into heaven and eternity with God. But if we go to the College of Hell, we are majoring in ourself and our sin, our petty resentments, our ingratitude, our refusal to be guided by the one who created us. And if we graduate from the College of Hell, then we'll be in hell because it is what we're seeking. Distance from God, no accountability. These are stark options. Now, if the College of Heaven had an alma mater, it would be, Thy will be done. But if the College of Hell had an alma mater, you know what I think it would be? Well, does anybody know what the real national anthem of America is? It's not God Bless America or the Star-Spangled Banner. I'll give you a hint. It was sung by Frank Sinatra. Yes, the alma mater of hell is, I did it my way. Well, so far in the last few minutes, I have spoken of hell as necessary because it's necessary for those in hell who don't want to be in the presence of God but prefer their sin, their grumble going on forever. But there's another reason, I want to end quickly, why there needs to be hell. Because as Lewis says, hell is ultimately a cosmic quarantine. We understand this in the days of quarantine. Folks, we need hell not only for the sake of those in hell, but for the sake of those in heaven. If the people from hell were allowed to move permanently to hell, they would spoil it. They would tear down everything with their cynicism and their angst and their refusal to accept joy. And what's good news here? Heaven is above such pettiness. Heaven is pure joy and pure intimacy in the presence of God. Let me explain what I mean. Have you ever gone on a church picnic with your church and you're all excited? It's great. But somebody brings with them on the bus one little spoiled brat. Little Adolf has decided he's not going to have fun today, and so nobody's going to have fun today. And you know what, friends? In this fallen, broken, fragmented world in which we live, that one little spoiled brat can ruin the entire day for everyone. But I have good news. There are no spoiled brats in heaven. Heaven is above such things. I know it sounds great to say nobody can be happy until everybody's happy, but watch out. That kind of false thinking will take a garden and turn it into a sewer. Heaven is finally a release from all of that pettiness and resentment and bitterness that causes such pain and sorrow that divides families. Heaven is above that. There are no more spoiled brats in heaven. Let me close in prayer. Father God, as we continue through this quarantine, at least let it be a time for self-reflection. Lord, help us to surrender that bitterness, that envy, that anger and ingratitude that drags us away from you. Let us rather open our arms and embrace your love and your grace and your mercy. In Jesus' name, amen. Blessings to you all. Keep healthy.